Hi, I'm doing a thing. I'm looking at St. Thomas Aquinas today. I'm looking at his Summa Theologica, his Catechism, to do with, his Catechism of the Summa Theologica. The Summa Theologica is one of the for those of you who don't know, it's one of the greatest books written in the Catholic Church, if not the greatest book written in the Catholic Church, um, by a theologian, because it basically is the compendium of our faith. It reiterates everything that we stand to hold, that we stand as reason and as faith, like how it interprets and deciphers all the things to do with faith through a philosophical lens, how we can arrive at these conclusions through reason itself and with faith attached. It's a huge work, and it used to be required reading and required to be in every seminary throughout the world by canon law. And this particular one, it's written by St. Thomas Aquinas, but it's translated by this man named Thomas Peggs, who was a master in theology. As you can see, Benedict the 15th had written something quite nice about it. We congratulate you sincerely on this fruit of your labors, which shows your masterly knowledge of St. Thomas' doctrine. We hope, therefore, through your love of Holy Church, that this work will bring many souls to a sound knowledge of Christian doctrine. So, just to start off, I'm going to be very brief because I've actually recorded this multiple times, and because the recording wasn't working very well when I was trying to do like this advanced video background stuff. It just didn't work as well. So I'm gonna just continue on from where I was, which is just from the beginning. So I wasn't continuing on from anywhere. This is to do with of God's existence. So that's how he starts off. Does God exist? Yes, God exists. Why do you say that God exists? Because if God did not exist, nothing would exist. How do you prove that if God did not exist, nothing would exist? It is proved by this argument: that which exists through God only would not exist if God did not exist. Because it follows, right? If they exist through God only, it would not exist if God did not exist. But whatever exists that is not God exists through God only. Therefore, if God does not exist, nothing would exist. So if it existed, and it existed through God, if God did not exist, it doesn't exist. It wouldn't exist. Nothing would exist. And how do you prove that whatever exists that is not God exists through God only? By this argument, final analysis shows that which does not exist of itself can only exist through some other which exists of itself, and this latter we call God. But whatever exists that is not God does not exist of itself. Therefore, final analysis shows that whatever exists that is not God exists through God only. It's a bit much, that stuff. It gets a bit confusing, but if you follow through the particular phrases that he uses. Which does not exist of itself can only exist through some other which exists of itself. Can only exist through some other which exists of itself, in this latter we call it God. Because God exists of himself, he does not need anyone to exist. Whatever exists that is not God does not exist of itself. Therefore, final analysis shows that whatever exists that is not God exists through God only. Final analysis shows that whatever exists that is not God exists through God only. Because God himself is self-sufficient, he creates, and those that he creates, he's not going to make them to be self-sufficient as well. Well, this is just my reasoning right now. He's going to make imperfect beings, and they are going to be sufficient. They're going to be sufficient in that they exist depending on him. Now we can see this through the way human beings themselves are sufficient, not just sufficient, but they are dependent on food resources to survive. Like a city collapses without food because the people eventually starve to death. This can be measured from the macrocosm to the microcosm. So if you look at people, a person who just does not eat food for a couple of days eventually dies, feels sick and dies because he can't have anything to sustain him. In the same way, without God, we cannot sustain ourselves because God is the one who gave us all these things. So that's what the argument he's trying to say here. Why is it that whoever has need of another does not exist of itself? Because that which exists of itself neither depends nor could it depend upon anything or anybody. On the other hand, whatever has need of something or somebody depends upon this something or this somebody. But why do you assert that which exists of itself neither depends nor could depend on something or on somebody? Because existing of itself has everything in itself and through itself, and can receive nothing either from anything or from anybody. Okay, so therefore every existing thing that has need of some other and manifestly proves by its very existence that God exists. Yes, every existing thing that has need of some other manifestly proves by its very existence that God exists. What then do those say who deny the existence of God? They say, what has need of all has need of nothing, and conversely. So what they're saying, or the atheist argument, is that since he has everything, therefore he doesn't not need to create. I mean, contextually doesn't make any sense, because what St. Thomas Aquinas is doing is he's making an implicatory argument. He's implying through nature, through what we see, that there is something that is created because that has created us. Because we definitely do need something. We need money, we need food, we need things like resources and stuff like that. And even on an emotive scale, we need relationships, we need companionship, we need people to take away our loneliness. And in a bigger scale, we need God, because God is the one who created us. That's what seems to be presupposed through this argument. I think it's an okay argument. I think, like, if I can think of a counter argument, I mean, the atheist would say, well, how do you know that God exists? Just because you exist does not mean that God exists. Well, on the contrary, of course it does, because if I exist, it presupposes a distinction. The distinction being that I exist and I need something. I cannot exist of myself. But therefore, that would mean that there is something that does exist of itself, which is God, because God is the distinction from humanity and from all the creatures that exist, because creatures themselves presuppose a creation. And in that distinction, that which exists of itself and that which does not exist of itself can be made through logic itself. It's comparable. Of course, an atheist would probably argue, well, it doesn't necessarily mean it's comparable. Just because something does exist of other things does not mean that there is something that does not exist of itself. Which I think it's an okay argument. But if you unpack it to its rudiments, if I exist not of myself, if they accept the premise that I do not exist in myself, then of course I have to go down that logical thinking, which is I do not exist in myself. Therefore, where did I come from if I do not exist in myself? Because all these things that I see, they eventually fade away. But we keep returning to the point, which is, well, we keep manifesting upon this idea that I'm sorry, I'm rambling a bit, but what I'm trying to say is that we do have we are created, and if we are not created, then where did we come from? I mean, that's as simply put as I was trying to make it. The atheist argument would be, well, it doesn't necessarily mean usually is what they seem to argue. It doesn't necessarily mean that just because we are here does not mean that we were created. We could just be here, which isn't a good enough answer, right? It doesn't have enough telos in the argument structure. It doesn't have enough purpose in trying to figure out why we're here. It doesn't try and answer that question. So, for as skeptical as atheism is, it doesn't get skeptical enough. So then, yeah, it's foolish to deny the existence of God, because atheistic arguments are foolish. Like most of the atheistic arguments there are like, well, God doesn't exist because I don't have a photograph of God, or like I don't have a video evidence of God, which is just ridiculous, right? I mean, if you're talking about an infinite infinite creator who exists of himself, well, how do you think you're going to summon him into a lab to try and sort of test him? You think that that is the best way of testing someone who is infinite, like who's basically your definition of genius, someone who's perfect, infinite, wise in all things? You think that he's just going to visit the earth just to prove that he exists, just so that you could deny him later? Well, it could have just been a trick of my imagination. It could have just been this, because atheistic reasoning just is basically hyperbolic doubt. And I think I'm going to stop there. I may have hemmed and hawed for a bit too long, but I think I got the gist of it again. I think it's just you have to understand that there's distinctions in all of St. Thomas's writings. So he will make the distinction here that there is that which does not exist of itself and that which does exist of itself. And that distinction is primarily made by the fact that there is something called that which does not exist of itself, namely humans, creation, all that stuff. It exists not of itself, but of depending on something else. If that it depends on something else, we can take that logical thought to its conclusions and find out that there is something which does not exist of itself. Sorry, which does exist of itself. Sorry, and if that thing that exists of itself exists, therefore then it sort of follows, because it's just that thing that exists not of itself has the distinction of that which exists of itself. That was my basic understanding of this stuff. I'm not a master theologian, but I'm trying to understand this stuff the best way I can. And I think I'll stop there for today.